This photograph surfaced in an old Nebraska archive, dated, at least according to the faded pencil mark on the back, October 1944. But no one seems to know who actually took it. Was it a military photographer, a grieving neighbor, or perhaps someone who understood that this moment should never be forgotten? Look closely. A young woman in worn work clothes kneels beside a fresh grave, her hands stained with soil. Behind her stands an American farmer, hat pressed to his chest, eyes lowered as if in mourning, or guilt. The wooden cross casts a long shadow across the field, and the empty prairie behind them feels unsettlingly silent. Who was this woman? Why was she digging a grave on American soil during the middle of World War II? And why does the farmer seem to be thanking her? What happened here, and why, remains one of the strangest stories hidden in the war's forgotten corners. October 14, 1944, near Lexington, Nebraska. The ground was still wet with morning frost when 3 German women, prisoners of war, lifted shovels and began to dig a grave for an American farmer's wife. It should not have happened, not in the middle of a world war, not on American soil, not with enemies standing in the quiet fields of Nebraska, their breath rising in cold ribbons as they sank shovels into earth meant for a woman they had never met. 12 hours earlier, Martha Ellsworth had died in her sleep, pneumonia, sudden and merciless. Her husband, Thomas, a man of 51 with broad shoulders and hands shaped by decades of harvests, had sat beside her bed until the doctor finally closed his bag and said there was nothing more to be done. By sunrise, he faced the truth that haunts every widower. Grief does not pause for war, nor does the land. There were chores to finish, livestock to feed, and a grave to dig in ground already stiffening for winter. But he had no sons at home, no hired hands, no neighbors available for miles. Every able-bodied man had shipped out months ago to fight in Europe or the Pacific. So when a truck from the nearby POW labor detachment rolled onto his property at dawn, Thomas stepped onto the porch expecting half a dozen German farm boys, young male prisoners who had been helping local families since manpower shortages began choking rural America. Instead, the canvas flap lifted, and 3 women climbed down. Women, in gray uniforms, their hair tied back in practical knots, their eyes cautious but alert. The lieutenant accompanying them cleared his throat. "Sir, these are auxiliaries, radio operators, clerks. The men are already out on assignment. These were the only hands I could spare." Thomas looked at them as if someone had handed him a riddle instead of help. German women, out here, unshackled? Nothing made sense. Their boots crunched on the frost as they approached. The tallest, perhaps 24, nodded once in a gesture that was almost military. Another woman held her coat closed with a trembling hand, glancing at the farmhouse windows as if expecting rifles to appear. The third kept her gaze on the ground, studying the soil like a familiar enemy. "Your wife," the lieutenant said quietly. "We heard what happened. The colonel agreed to send assistance. They'll do whatever you need." Whatever he needed. The words landed with a weight Thomas was not ready for. He led them to the family plot, a small rise overlooking rows of harvested corn, the stalks brittle and pale in the morning light. The women listened without interrupting, the way soldiers listen when they are trying to understand a foreign language through tone alone. Then they lifted the shovels. The shock of it hit Thomas only when he heard the first metallic strike. Clang, clang, clang. German hands breaking American soil. German prisoners digging a grave for a woman who had spent her life baking bread for neighbors. sewing quilts through long winters and writing letters to a son fighting in the Philippines. The lieutenant stayed only a few minutes before heading back toward the truck. "They'll be safe," he said. "The war is a world away from here." And he drove off, leaving Thomas alone with 3 women who had once worn the insignia of an enemy his newspapers called monstrous. He expected fear from them. He did not expect silence, steady, purposeful, almost reverent. The taller woman paused first. "Was she loved?" she asked in careful English. Thomas swallowed hard. 40 years, he managed. "We were married 40 years. The shovels resumed, but something in the rhythm changed. What had begun as labor slowly shifted into ritual. In 1944, the United States was producing 96,000 aircraft and more cargo ships than any nation in history. Steel and grain and oil flowing from factories like an unending tide. But out here in the heartland, strength was measured differently. Not by tonnage or production charts, but by quiet acts of decency, feeding prisoners 3 meals a day, assigning them fair work, allowing them dignity even when propaganda painted them as enemies. These women had expected chains, dogs, punishment. Instead, they had been given gloves, hot coffee, bread with real butter. And today, they had been trusted beyond the fence line. As they dug, the sun rose higher, warming the frost into a dark, damp scent that mingled with corn husks drifting across the field. One woman paused, removed her gloves, and touched the soil with bare fingers, whispering something in German. A prayer, maybe, or a memory. Then, without prompting, the 3 of them began to hum. It started faintly, notes carried by breath more than voice. A melody shaped by centuries of Lutheran hymns, the kind once sung in old country churches where wooden pews creaked and candles flickered in drafty windows. Thomas recognized it instantly. His mother had sung the English version every winter. The sound struck him harder than grief. He stood frozen, leaning on the fence post, feeling something inside him loosen for the first time since Martha's last breath. The women's voices grew steadier, blending in soft harmony as they worked. Not loud, not performative, simply present. A lament in a foreign tongue rising in the middle of an American field. And Thomas, an American farmer, a husband, a man taught since childhood that enemies were to be resisted, not welcomed, felt tears slipping hot and unstoppable down his face. 3 German prisoners. Women who had never known his wife, who owed him nothing, who came from a nation that wanted his own sons dead, were singing for her. He removed his hat, not out of patriotism, not out of duty, but out of awe. Somewhere in his mind, a question broke open like sunrise. Why would they do this? Why would the enemy mourn with me? Shock settled into the cold air around them. Not the violence of war, but the quieter shock of discovering that humanity can bloom even in soil turned over by conflict. The hymn drifted across the field, across the rows of harvested corn, across a country at the height of its industrial might, reminding him, and reminding us, that even in 1944, when the world was burning, America still believed in something larger than victory, mercy. And this was the day mercy took the shape of 3 German women digging a grave for an American wife. The women had not spoken during the entire ride from the POW camp to the Ellsworth farm. The open-bed truck rattled over gravel roads, cornfields passing in long golden blurs, but none of the 3 dared lift their eyes long enough to admire the American landscape. Their hands were clenched around the wooden bench, knuckles white, breaths shallow. They had all heard the same rumors. The Americans will execute you outside the camp. They will make you disappear so they don't have to feed you. Female prisoners are used for experiments. If you are taken alone, they will not bring you back. Propaganda did not need to be believable. It only needed to be repeated. Since June 1944, when Allied forces captured pockets of female German auxiliaries in France and Italy, the Reich's rumor mills had worked overtime to terrify them. They were told that Americans hated German women most of all, that they would be humiliated, violated, punished for the crimes of their nation. And despite every humane interaction they had seen inside the POW compounds, the outside world still gnawed at their imaginations. Inside the camp, they had beds, rations, warm blankets. It was safe, safer, in fact, than the ruins of Stuttgart, Hamburg, Munich. Some women whispered at night that being an American POW was the first time in years they had slept without hearing air raid sirens. But outside the fence? Outside was unknown, and the unknown, after 5 years of war, felt like death. So when the truck slowed, when the engine coughed, when the guard said quietly, "This is the place," the women exchanged glances sharp with dread. One of them, Liesel, murmured, "Dies ist das Ende." This is the end. Anna, the youngest, swallowed hard. "Maybe they just want us to work," she whispered, though she did not believe her own words. Then the farm came into view. A white-painted house with green shutters, an American flag hanging still in the cold air, a shotgun propped beside the porch door, and a man standing alone, his hat clutched against his chest, shoulders sagging with a grief so deep it felt like gravity. To the women, it did not look like grief. It looked like judgment. They froze on the back of the truck. The guard gestured. "Go on. He won't harm you." But their feet resisted. Every instinct told them to stay inside the vehicle, to cling to the last barrier between themselves and the stories they'd heard since girlhood. Yet the guard's tone held no cruelty, just routine, as though escorting enemy women onto an American farm was no more unusual than delivering mail. Reluctantly, they climbed down. The cold bit through their thin uniforms. The earth felt unsteady beneath their boots. The American farmer, Thomas Ellsworth, did not approach them. He simply nodded once, eyes wet, jaw trembling. That was all. But in their fear-clouded minds his silence confirmed their terror. He hates us. He wants us gone. He wants us punished for his wife's death. They did not know that Thomas was barely holding himself together. His wife had been alive yesterday morning, smiling faintly as she tried to sit up, and dead by nightfall. Pneumonia had stolen her breath before he could send for help, and now he stood in the cold wind, a widower of 12 hours, staring at 3 German women delivered to his doorstep by a military truck he had not asked for. He hadn't known what to expect when the lieutenant at the POW camp said, "We can send laborers to help. The men are assigned elsewhere. But we have several female prisoners available." Female prisoners, foreign soldiers, brought into his home on the very morning he planned to bury his wife. His mind raced with fears he didn't want to admit out loud. What if they break something? What if they hurt the livestock? What if they steal? What if they have hatred in their hearts? War reshapes trust. Even the kindest Americans had limits, and Thomas had never imagined his morning would look like this: a grieving farmer forced to rely on the hands of the very people his son was fighting overseas. His son, Daniel, somewhere in the Pacific, eating canned rations under monsoon rains while Japanese artillery thundered in the distance. Every night, Thomas prayed the boy was safe. And now, staring at these German women, enemies by definition, he felt a protective heat rise in his throat. This was his land, his home, his grief. He did not want it trespassed, but he needed help. and pride is a fragile thing when grief breaks it open. So he forced himself to breathe, to swallow his instinctive suspicion, and to gesture toward the small family cemetery beyond the barn. "There," he said softly. The women stiffened at the single English word. In their minds, this sounded like a command, perhaps the final command. The path to the burial plot felt endless. Every rustling leaf, every creaking branch sounded like a weapon being drawn. Anna flinched when she saw the farmer's shotgun by the barn door. It was a simple hunting tool, but in her imagination it became the instrument of their punishment. They wondered if this was why they had been sent out alone. No witnesses, no paperwork, just an efficient disappearance. They had heard stories of POWs in Russia. They could not help but imagine America the same way. Yet, as they walked farther from the truck, past the farmhouse windows decorated with lace curtains, past the barn where a lonely horse nickered inside, something else began to unsettle them. The quiet. Germany, by 1944, was a land of ruins. Bombed cities, shattered glass, blocked roads. America, by contrast, was wealthy, intact, impossibly calm. There were no craters in the fields, no burned-out chimneys, no collapsed roofs. Just abundance, just safety. It terrified them even more. A country so strong, so untouched, must surely have no mercy for its enemies. Meanwhile, Thomas walked several steps ahead of them, rehearsing all the ways this could go wrong. He remembered hearing that some POWs still believed in Nazism, that they resented America's strength, that they would sabotage farms or steal food. Yet he also remembered something the lieutenant had said when delivering them. They follow rules, they work hard, they're grateful not to be starving. Grateful. He had not considered that. He had never known hunger like Europe knew hunger. He had never stood in a ration line. He had never watched a city burn. But these women had. Perhaps that was why they walked so quietly behind him, because fear was the only certainty they still understood. When they reached the burial ground, the women halted. Anna's breath came fast. Liesel's hands shook visibly. The third woman whispered a prayer beneath her breath, a plea to be spared. Thomas turned, saw their terror, and felt a pang of shame so sudden it pierced through his grief. They thought he meant to harm them, and the realization broke something open in him, because even in the darkest morning of his life, even wrapped in fresh grief and suspicion, he knew this truth. America did not harm its prisoners. Not here, not on his farm, not ever, if he could help it. And so the first bridge between them formed not from kindness, not from trust, but from the mutual, trembling fear that neither side wanted to admit. Fear, strangely, was the first thing they shared, and it would be the first thing to fall. The winter sun had climbed just high enough to warm the tops of the cornstalks when Thomas Ellsworth realized the three women were shivering. Their uniforms, thin gray wool issued by the U.S. Army to replace their German garments, were never meant for the Nebraska cold. He saw them rubbing their hands together, breath fogging in pale clouds, eyes fixed on the ground as though waiting for danger to emerge from the soil itself. He cleared his throat, softly so as not to startle them. "You'll need these," he said, holding out 3 pairs of work gloves. The women blinked. Not one of them moved. German soldiers, even male ones, rarely received gloves unless they bought them privately. Supplies were scarce. Uniforms were rationed. Their officers had taught them that comfort was weakness. Even in the camps, simple things like blankets and socks felt like luxuries. So they stared at the gloves the way a starving person stares at a feast. Skeptical, hopeful, confused. Finally, Anna, the youngest, stepped forward. Her hands trembled as she reached for the offered pear. She expected him to pull back at the last second, to test her obedience, to mock her need. But he didn't. He simply placed the gloves in her hands and nodded once. The second woman followed, then the third, and just like that, a tiny invisible wire snapped inside them. A rule they had been taught since childhood, that Americans were cruel, selfish, eager to see Germans suffer, was quietly, irrevocably broken. Thomas gestured toward the water pump beside the barn. "Drink if you need to," he said. "Water's clean." Clean water. Another strange kindness. Most of them had grown up boiling river water, rationing it, sharing cups. During the final years of the Reich, even officers drank from tin buckets passed among soldiers. But here, on an enemy farm, they were being invited to refresh themselves without fear of punishment. Anna approached first. She hesitated, gripping the pump handle like a trap. She forced it downward. The metal groaned, and a gush of cold, clear water spilled over her cupped hands. She drank, carefully, suspiciously, waiting for bitterness, or the metallic taste of chemicals. But it tasted like nothing at all, like purity, like peace. One by one, the other two women drank as well. Not greedily, but reverently, as though the water itself was a kind of forgiveness. Thomas waited. He wasn't a man of many words, but he understood something essential. Grief did not excuse cruelty. His wife, Martha, would have wanted him to remain the man she knew, fair, patient, principled, even today, especially today. When the women returned, he motioned gently toward the half-dug grave. "You don't need to be afraid," he said. The words came out raw, almost embarrassed. I just want to bury my wife properly. That's all." The women exchanged glances, uncertain, then softened by something they had not felt since leaving Germany: compassion. They lifted their shovels again. The work was slow at first. The soil fought them, packed tight from the season's first frosts, but their movements grew more fluid as the sun crept higher. The gloves Thomas had given them made an enormous difference, warm enough to ease their grip, thick enough to prevent blisters. Each strike of metal into earth was a little less painful, a little more sure. But fear still lingered. When Anna stumbled over a tree root, her foot twisting sharply, she let out a startled cry and dropped her shovel. Instinct took over. She shrank back, raising her hands as though bracing for a blow. Thomas's reaction stunned her. He rushed forward, not angrily but with genuine concern. "You all right?" he asked, bending down. She didn't move. Couldn't. Her breath caught in her throat. The space between them felt like the edge of a cliff. He reached toward her ankle. She flinched violently. "I'm just checking," he said gently. "Just checking." Slowly, cautiously, he examined the joint. His hands were rough, from farm work, but his touch was careful. He could have yanked her upright, barked at her for clumsiness, treated her as less than human. Instead, he supported her weight. Instead, he said, "Lean on me." Instead, he helped her stand. And Anna, German prisoner, enemy of the United States, terrified girl far from home, did the unthinkable. She leaned, not because she trusted him yet, but because kindness, when unexpected, disarms a person more thoroughly than fear ever could. The other two women stared, recognizing the moment as something larger than a simple act of assistance. It was a refutation, a counter-argument, a crack in the doctrine they had been fed since adolescence. Americans are cruel. Americans hate Germans. Americans will make you pay. But here, in a small Nebraska field, an American farmer was steadying a German woman's weight with hands gentle enough to break her heart. Behind them, The farmhouse waited, its white boards gleaming in the angled sunlight. A windmill creaked, turning slow circles above the barn. In the kitchen window, lace curtains moved in the breeze, the way Martha would open them every morning to let in the day. Thomas felt a lump in his throat when he saw the curtains sway. For a moment he almost imagined her silhouette there, a familiar softness, a reminder of a world that had existed only hours before. The POWs followed his gaze. "It was her window," he said quietly. Something shifted in the women's posture. Their faces softened, shovels lowering as they took in the stillness of the farm, the quiet dignity of this life they had never known. This was not a battlefield. This was not a prison. This was America in 1944, firm, structured but kind in ways that unnerved them. Here was a country whose strength did not depend on cruelty, whose abundance allowed mercy, whose people, ordinary people, chose integrity over vengeance. To the German women, it felt almost unreal. Their homeland was bombed-out streets, ration cards, the shriek of air raid sirens. Here the air smelled of coffee from a pot warming on a wood stove, of hay and corn and autumn leaves, of a life that seemed untouched by the collapsing world across the ocean. They felt envy. They felt awe. They felt unexpectedly safe. And when Thomas returned to the gravesite and lifted his hat in silent apology for interrupting the work, Anna spoke the first word she had offered him all morning. "We will help," she said quietly. "For your wife." Not because they were ordered, not because they feared punishment, but because kindness, real kindness, had been shown. Thomas nodded, eyes shining. "Thank you." The women resumed digging, their rhythm steadier now, their movements no longer trembling but purposeful. Fear had not vanished, but something warmer had entered the space between them. Respect, recognition. The first fragile thread of shared humanity. In that cold Nebraska morning, with sunlight warming the frost and a windmill turning in slow, thoughtful circles, the world's largest war paused, just for a moment. Long enough for 3 German prisoners to realize that their enemy was not the monster they had been taught to hate. Long enough for an American farmer to remember the man he still wanted to be. Long enough for kindness to take root. By mid-afternoon, the grave was nearly complete. The women's breath rose in slow, heavy clouds as they paused to rest, leaning on their shovels, their faces flushed from labor and emotion neither side had expected to feel. The wind carried the scent of dry leaves and distant wood smoke, a reminder that autumn was settling in across Nebraska, and winter was only weeks away. Thomas stood a few steps back, watching them, his hat clutched in both hands. He had not spoken much since morning. Speech seemed fragile now, as if anything he said might shatter the uneasy peace that had grown between them. The women, too, had fallen quiet in a more contemplative way. Fear had softened into sympathy, and sympathy was beginning to take a shape none of them had words for. It was Anna who asked first. She looked up at him, eyes shy but steady. "Sir." What was her name? The question struck him harder than he expected. For hours he had thought of nothing but her name. She had been everywhere. In the wind that shook the cornstalks, in the shadow of the windmill, in the quiet creak of the farmhouse steps. Hearing a stranger ask for it, a German stranger, felt almost like reopening the wound intentionally. He swallowed. "Martha," he said softly. Her name was Martha. The women exchanged a glance. They recognized the tenderness in his voice. They recognized the kind of love that does not end when breath does. Thomas reached into the pocket of his jacket, hesitated, then slowly pulled out a small square of fabric, white cotton embroidered with pale blue thread. He held it for a long moment before extending it to them. "This was hers," he said. "She kept it folded in the drawer by the stove. Always smelled of soap. I found it this morning when I opened her things." Anna accepted it carefully as though it were glass. The cotton was soft, worn at the edges. A faint scent clung to it. Homemade lye soap, lavender, and something else, something warm and familiar. The second POW, Liesel, leaned closer to look. Her breath hitched. Then, without warning, her face crumpled. "My mother," she whispered. "She had this same pattern, the same stitching. She made them for us before the war. We lost everything when Stuttgart was bombed." Her voice broke. She pressed the cloth to her face, just for a moment, just long enough to remember, and tears welled and fell in silent streams. She wasn't crying because of Martha. She wasn't even crying because of the grave. She was crying because the cloth reminded her of a home she no longer had, of a mother she feared dead, of a world that was collapsing faster than anyone could stitch it back together. And in that moment, Thomas saw her differently. Not as an enemy, not as a prisoner, but as a daughter. A child torn from her family by a war that none of them had asked for. He took a slow step toward her. She didn't recoil. Something in his eyes, grief recognizing grief, told her she was safe. He spoke softly. I'm sorry for your loss, too." The words broke whatever dam still held inside her. She covered her face, shoulders shaking, and the other two women instinctively stepped around her in a circle of support. Then, without being asked, they resumed the work, but this time with a reverence that felt almost sacred. When the grave reached the proper depth, the women set aside their shovels. Anna stepped forward again, brushing hair from her face. "We would like, if it is allowed, to say a prayer," she said, "in our language. For Martha." Thomas hesitated only a second before nodding. He had heard German prayers before. His grandparents were Lutheran immigrants. He had grown up listening to hymns sung softly in pews, under stained-glass windows, in the hum of Sunday mornings. He knew that not everything spoken in the enemy's tongue was cruel. The women gathered at the foot of the grave. They linked hands, not tightly, but with a quiet solidarity that acknowledged their own losses as much as his. Then they began to sing. It was a hymn, old, slow, shaped by centuries of faith and winter and hardship. Their voices trembled at first, then steadied, rising over the Nebraska fields in haunting harmony. The sound was foreign, but the emotion was familiar. Thomas froze. The melody drifted into him like a memory carried on the wind. His mother had sung the same tune, the very same one, in English, years ago in their small Lutheran church. He remembered her hand on his shoulder, her voice cracking with age but still full of warmth, her faith woven into every line. Hearing it now, sung by German women, prisoners of war, standing over the fresh grave of his wife, shattered him. His knees buckled. He dropped to the ground. The hat fell from his hands. For the first time since Martha died, he wept. Not the restrained, dignified tears of a man taught to hide emotion, but deep, shaking, unguarded sobs that came from somewhere raw and ancient. The women faltered mid-hymn, startled, but then continued, softer now, as though adjusting their song to cradle his grief rather than accompany it. Thomas covered his face. He could not stop the tears. The sound of their voices, enemy voices yet so achingly familiar, stripped the war away, stripped the hatred away, stripped every boundary that nations and governments had built between them. All that remained were human beings standing together in the shadow of a grave. As the hymn ended, silence settled over the farm. Not an awkward silence, but the breathless stillness that follows revelation. The oldest POW woman spoke quietly, her accent gentle. War, it makes us strangers, but grief makes us the same. Thomas lifted his head. His cheeks were wet, his eyes were red. But something in his face had changed. Not softened, no, something stronger, as if grief had carved out space for compassion to grow. He looked at them, not through them, not past them, but at them. "You didn't have to do that," he whispered. "Yes," Anna replied, "we did." In that moment, a truth emerged as stark as the cold Nebraska sky. America, in 1944, was still a nation that believed in decency, not because of politics, not because of ideology, but because ordinary people, farmers, wives, neighbors, chose kindness even when war told them to choose hate. The women felt it, Thomas felt it, and modern readers feel it too, the unmistakable ache of nostalgia. Because America once looked like this, a nation strong enough to win a world war, yet gentle enough to honor the humanity of its enemies. A nation unified not by agreement, but by shared values. A nation where decency wasn't rare or radical. It was the norm. Standing at the edge of the grave, the war seemed smaller for a moment. The hatred seemed thinner. The fear seemed foolish. 3 German women, 1 grieving farmer, and a hymn older than any of them had broken through the walls built by governments, flags, and nations at war. Something had collapsed inside all of them. But what fell was not their strength, it was their distance, and in its place grew the first fragile bloom of understanding. Late afternoon settled over the Ellsworth farm in a wash of gold and long shadows. The grave was filled, the mound smoothed by careful hands, and 3 German women stood side by side with the American farmer whose world had been upended just one day earlier. None of them spoke at first. The silence was not awkward now. It was shared, as if each person needed to understand what had just happened. Anna was the first to truly look at Thomas without fear, not just at his boots or his hands or the tools he carried. She saw him, saw a man grieving, decent, tired, and still somehow gentle. It unsettled her more than the fear had. She turned slightly toward Liesel, who had finally stopped crying. "If this is the enemy," Anna whispered, barely audible. "What were we fighting for?" Liesel didn't answer. She couldn't. She stared at her dirt-stained gloves as though they held the truth. For years they had been told that America was decadent, cruel, morally rotten, that Americans would torture German prisoners, starve them, humiliate them, that surrender meant dishonor, that defeat meant annihilation. Yet here they were, standing safely on American soil, fed, clothed, and now trusted with a task as intimate as burying a man's beloved wife. Nothing in their indoctrination had prepared them for this. And slowly, painfully, something began to unravel. The ideology they had been raised under, the one that demanded obedience, worship of strength, and ruthless purity, suddenly felt small, fragile, even childish. Nazism had taught them to hate easily. America had shown them kindness difficult to understand. Which one was stronger? The question churned inside them. Thomas sensed the shift in their faces, in the stiffness of their shoulders loosening, in the way their eyes no longer darted with suspicion. It wasn't triumph he felt, nor satisfaction. It was something quieter, something older, recognition. He saw his wife in them, her insistence that people, even strangers, deserved dignity. He heard his mother's voice reminding him that decency was not forfeited in wartime. It was tested there. And he remembered the pastor in the little Lutheran church telling the congregation that grace meant nothing if it was given only to those we already loved. Now he understood. Grace meant offering kindness where it seemed undeserved, where it seemed unthinkable. Even to the people whose uniforms had once symbolized the death of your friends, your neighbors, your countrymen. He looked at the women again, this time without the weight of suspicion. "You helped me today," he said, his voice low but steady. "I won't forget that." The words felt almost foreign on his tongue, praising the enemy. Yet there was no bitterness, no hesitation, just truth. The women exchanged glances, cautious, emotional, grateful. "You treated us with respect," Liesel said, "more than our officers ever did." Thomas looked up sharply. "Your officers?" She nodded. "They gave orders, demands, punishment. There was no kindness, only service." The irony didn't escape him. The enemy he had been taught to fear, fanatical Nazis, stood before him describing their own leaders as cold, harsh, devoid of humanity. He exhaled slowly. "Well," he said, "you'll find Americans do things differently." Not because they were better, he thought, but because they had chosen to be. As the group walked back toward the farmhouse, the sun dipped behind the barn, painting the fields in amber light. The windmill spun lazily, creaking in a rhythm that had been the soundtrack of Thomas's entire life. The women followed him, each step feeling strangely heavier with realization. Anna finally spoke, her voice thoughtful. "In Germany, they told us America wanted to destroy us." Thomas stopped at the edge of the porch. He turned to her. "And do you still believe that?" She looked down at her gloves, then at the grave behind them. "No," she said simply. The other women nodded, though their eyes glistened. Liesel pressed the handkerchief, Martha's handkerchief, to her chest, as though it had become an anchor in the storm of her own beliefs. Thomas saw it, the transformation happening in real time. This wasn't surrender, this wasn't defeat. It was moral awakening, something few war stories ever. Capture that the greatest battles are won not with weapons, but with acts of decency so undeniable they rewire the heart. By 1944, thousands of captured Axis soldiers had been spread across American farms, factories, and mills, living under the Geneva Convention, earning camp wages, eating better than many German civilians left behind in the ruins. What the War Department had not expected was this. Kindness was turning prisoners into witnesses. Witnesses into believers. Believers into messengers. After the war, many POWs would return to Germany telling stories not of brutality, but of American fairness, American abundance, American humanity. They would tell their children, "America fed us when we had nothing. They gave us dignity when our own government had taken it away. They treated us as people, not enemies." Those testimonies would help shape the pro-democracy sentiment in post-war Germany. They would become a quiet foundation for America's role in rebuilding Europe. And all of it began with moments like this. A farmer helping an enemy girl with a twisted ankle. A set of work gloves offered without hesitation. A grave dug by hands from opposite sides of the world. A hymn sung in the language of the enemy but felt in the heart of the grieving husband. Moral revolutions are rarely loud. Most begin in silence, in a Nebraska field at dusk with the sound of soil settling over a woman named Martha. As they reached the porch, Thomas finally allowed himself a deeper breath. He felt lighter, still grieving, still raw, but less alone. He faced the women one last time. "You've done good work today," he said. "When you go back to camp, tell the guards I'll vouch for you." They nodded, touched in ways they couldn't articulate. Anna hesitated, then stepped forward. "Sir, thank you for everything, for not seeing us as enemies." Thomas shook his head. "War made us enemies, but we're still people." Those words seemed to strike them more deeply than anything else he'd said all day. People, not prisoners, not threats, not labels created by distant men in distant offices. Just people. And in that shared understanding, something irreversible took root, something that would follow the women long after they returned to camp, long after the war ended, long after Germany rebuilt itself from ashes, an idea dangerous to dictators and tyrants. The enemy is human, and humanity is stronger than fear. Years later, when historians would interview former POWs about their time in America, many would speak of turning points, not battles, not interrogations, not rations or living conditions, but moments of kindness. Moments when Americans, even in wartime, chose virtue over vengeance. For some women, it had been a warm meal. For others, a chance to work freely on horseback. For 3 of them, it had been this day. The day they helped bury Martha Ellsworth in the rich Nebraska soil under the wide American sky. Tjakuen, day they realized their enemy had shown them more dignity than their own regime ever had. And in that realization lay the seed of democracy, compassion, and renewal, quietly planted by a grieving farmer who, without knowing it, had helped change the hearts of those who once marched beneath Hitler's flag. A small act on a small farm, but its moral echo would carry far beyond the prairie. When the war finally ended in May of 1945, Camp Atlanta, where the POW women were held, buzzed with rumors. Some said they would be shipped home within weeks. Others claimed they'd be kept through winter to help the harvest. Still others whispered that Germany was gone, flattened, unrecognizable, and there might not be a home to return to. For the 3 women who had helped bury Martha Ellsworth, the news stirred a complicated mixture of relief, dread, and something unexpected. Sorrow at leaving the country they had once feared. The day of their departure, they stood in line with hundreds of other prisoners clutching thin suitcases filled with Red Cross-issued clothing and a few precious belongings. Anna carried the work gloves Thomas had given her. Liesel held the white handkerchief of Martha's that Thomas insisted she keep. The 3rd woman, Greta, held a small tin of soil from the burial site, a reminder of the day the enemy became her teacher. When the truck engines rumbled to life, they searched the road for a familiar figure, hoping he might appear. And he did. Thomas stood beside the fence line, hat pressed to his chest, chin trembling. He hadn't meant to come. He had told himself it was unnecessary, that the women would not care whether he was there. But as the weeks passed after that day, the quiet of the farm grew unbearable. The grave behind the barn settled into the earth, and he found himself thinking of the young women who had stood beside him, who had treated his grief with gentleness he hadn't expected from anyone, let alone 3 prisoners. He had no words for them now, but he didn't need any. The women lifted their hands in farewell. He nodded, eyes blurred. The trucks pulled away. Their lives would never cross again, but their stories would. Germany, winter 1946. When the women returned home, they stepped into a nation of ruins. Cities were gutted skeletons of brick. Schools and churches burned hollow. Families scattered. Food nearly non-existent. German civilians were allotted fewer than even 200 calories per day. Children fainted in the streets. Elderly people died quietly in line waiting for bread. Entire neighborhoods lived in cellars because the buildings above them had no roofs. For the POW women, it was a second shock. America had been a land of unthinkable abundance. real bread, real milk, real shelter. Here, in the ruins of the Reich, survival felt like labor. Neighbors listened in disbelief when they told their stories. In America, we slept in warm beds. In America, guards treated us with respect. In America, they gave us more food than we had seen in years. In America, they let us bury their dead. At first, people didn't believe them. Then others returned home, confirming the same, and a quiet truth began to circulate, spreading through bombed-out towns and makeshift soup lines. America fed us when we had nothing. America treated us like humans when our own government did not. This truth mattered, because from it, a generation of Germans began to question everything they had once accepted, everything they had repeated without thinking, everything their leaders had told them. And in that questioning, democracy found soil. In the spring of 1947, nearly 2 years after the war, Thomas received a letter written in careful English and postmarked from Stuttgart. He sat at the kitchen table where Martha once brewed morning coffee, where they had read the newspaper every day of their marriage, where he had eaten alone since the war took her. The envelope felt delicate in his hands. He opened it slowly. Dear Mr. Ellsworth, today I buried my own mother. The ground was cold. I had no tools, only my hands and the help of one neighbor. While I worked, I remembered you. I remembered how you buried your wife, and how you let us, your enemies, help you. You trusted us to do something sacred. You taught me dignity. You taught me how to mourn with grace. You taught me what my country forgot to teach. I wanted you to know that your kindness did not stay in America. It traveled home with me. With respect, Liesl Bauer Thomas read the letter twice, 3 times, tears falling onto the page. He folded it carefully, placed it in the drawer beside Martha's recipe cards, and closed it with quiet reverence. He was not a man who ever thought of himself as part of history. Yet here was proof. One act of kindness had crossed oceans. Decades passed. The farm remained, though the windmill's paint faded and the barn roof needed replacing every few years. Thomas grew older than old. The pain of losing Martha dulled but never disappeared, like a scar beneath a shirt sleeve. But the story lived on. In the 1980s, a German tourist arrived at the farm, Liesl's granddaughter. She brought flowers to the grave, placed them gently, and cried softly as Thomas watched from the porch. My grandmother survived because an American farmer showed her compassion, she said through tears. She told that story for the rest of her life. In the 2000s, a historian tracking former POW experiences uncovered the Ellsworth story and included it in a university archive. Letters from descendants arrived, some handwritten, some emailed. My great-grandmother always said America saved her soul. My family thinks differently about the U.S. because of your grandfather. This is the America we were taught to admire. And in recent years, those same descendants have left comments on videos, articles, digital memorials. My grandmother survived because an American farmer showed her compassion. A simple sentence, but powerful enough to move strangers to tears. For American readers, there is something deeply familiar and deeply nostalgic about this story. A reminder of a nation that once believed kindness was strength. A reminder of a generation, the greatest generation, who fought a brutal war but refused to let brutality define them. A reminder that America once stood not only as an arsenal of democracy, but as a home of decency, humility, and quiet moral courage. In the 1940s, Americans were united not by perfection, but by principle. They believed character mattered. They believed how you treated the vulnerable said more about your patriotism than any speech or uniform. Thomas Ellsworth never claimed to be a hero. He never spoke publicly about the day 3 German prisoners helped bury his wife, but in his farmhouse, preserved in a drawer beside Martha's handkerchief, the truth endured. He chose humanity, and it changed the world for someone. Then their children, then their grandchildren. This is how legacy works. It is not built in monuments or parades. It is built in fields, in quiet acts, in choices made when no one is watching. A farmer offers gloves to enemy prisoners. 3 frightened women dig a grave with reverence. A hymn crosses languages and breaks a man's heart open, and decades later, families on both sides of the Atlantic look back and say, "That is America at its best." And they are right. In the years that followed, the Ellsworth farm changed in small ways. Seasons came and went, crops rose and fell. The windmill groaned faithfully through heat waves and blizzards. But one thing never changed: the grave behind the barn. It remained exactly where 3 German women had stood side by side with the American farmer they once feared. Grass grew around its edges, soft and unruly, and each spring wildflowers appeared with stubborn persistence, as if the earth itself refused to forget. And perhaps that is the heart of this story. The earth remembers what people often forget, because this was never truly a story about war, not about nations or uniforms or victories, not even about prisoners of war. This was a story about what human beings choose to do at their most fragile moments. When grief is fresh, when fear is high, when hatred is easy and kindness is hard. It was about dignity offered freely, mercy given without condition, and compassion that made itself known in the most unlikely of places: a Nebraska field, a shovel, a hymn in a foreign tongue. The greatest generation earned its name not simply by defeating tyranny, but by refusing to become tyrants themselves. They won the war with courage, but they won the peace with character. In a time defined by sacrifice, ration books, war bonds, telegrams edged in black, Americans still found room for empathy. They still believed that decency wasn't weakness, that mercy wasn't naive, that how you treat the defeated matters just as much as how you confront the aggressor. And for 3 German women whose world had been built on lies and fear, America's humanity rewrote everything. It showed them a country not driven by cruelty but steadied by principle. Not proud of its might alone, but proud of the quiet moral choices made far from cameras or headlines. The choices that reveal who a nation really is. Today, America struggles with a different kind of battle, not overseas, not against foreign armies, but within itself, fractured by politics, suspicion, bitterness, and noise. And yet this story calls across the decades with a simple reminder: this is who we were. This is who we can be again. A people who looked beyond uniforms. A people who offered help even when it was undeserved. A people who believed that morality wasn't optional. A people who buried their dead with honor and allowed their enemies to help. In the final memory of that day in 1944, the image is quiet. A small grave in the wind. Nebraska sky stretching endless and blue overhead. 3 German POW women walking back toward the military truck, their hands dirty, their hearts strangely lighter. They glance back only once. And at the edge of the field stands Thomas Ellsworth, hat over his chest. Boots planted firmly in the soil his wife once tended. Tears slipping down a face weathered by sun and grief. The hymn they sang still echoing in his memory. He lifts his chin just enough for them to hear him whisper, "Thank you, all of you." Not because they were Germans, not because they were prisoners, but because, for one brief moment in the middle of a world on fire, they met each other not as enemies, but as human beings. And that is the legacy that endures. That is the lesson worth carrying forward. That is the America worth remembering.